Accounting for factory overhead. Classification of overhead. Sa classification of overhead, we have indirect materials, indirect labor, and yung indirect expense. So yung mga indirect expense, ito yung mga items ng manufacturing overhead na classifiable as indirect materials or indirect labor, such as heat, light, and power for factory, rent on factory building, depreciation and maintenance of factory building, and factory equipment, property taxes on factory building. Factory overhead costs are divided into three categories on the basis of their behavior in relation to production. The categories are: number 1, variable overhead; number 2, fixed overhead; and number 3, mixed overhead. Variable factory overhead costs. These are the factory overhead costs that vary in direct proportion to the level of production within the relevant range. That is, the greater the number of units produced, the higher the total variable cost. So, ang behavior ng variable factory overhead is directly proportion siya doon sa level of production, meaning the more production, the more level of production, mas mataas ang variable cost. The lesser the number of units produced, the lower the variable cost. So naka-vary siya directly dun sa level ng production. Fixed factory overhead cost. These are the factory overhead costs that remain constant within the relevant range, regardless of the varying levels of production. The total remains constant, but the fixed cost per unit varies inversely with the production. That is, the greater the number of units produced, the lower the fixed cost per unit. Okay. Ito namang fixed factory overhead cost, ang behavior niya is fixed siya, remaining constant siya within the relevant range of the varying levels of production. So, madaling salita, ang fixed factory overhead cost is fixed siya whatever the level of production, provided na yung level of production ay nandun pa din sa tinatawag na relevant range. And ang effect naman ng fixed cost sa fixed cost per unit is the more na dumadami ang production units, mas lumiliit ang fixed cost per unit. So, ano ba yung example ng fixed factory overhead? Popular example nun ay depreciation of factory building. Let's say, ang depreciation of factory building ay 100,000 per month. And yung number na units produced ay 10,000 units. So, kung ito ang depreciation of factory building per month na 100,000 at ang number ng units na produced per month ay 10,000 units, therefore, ang fixed cost per unit ay 10 pesos per unit. Ang sabi, the greater the number of units produced, the lower the fixed cost per unit. So, let's say, still 100%, 100,000 yung depreciation ng factory building. Next month, syempre, fixed factory overhead yan. So, fixed siya within relevant range. Pero, ang na-produce na unit ay, let's say, lumaki. Naging 20,000 units. Ibig sabihin, yung fixed cost per unit ng next month, 100,000 divided by 20,000 units, that is 5. The greater the number of units produced, so yung 10,000 naging 20,000, the lower the fixed cost per unit. So yung 10 naging 5 na lang, lumiit. Mixed factory overhead costs. These factory overhead costs are neither wholly fixed nor wholly variable in nature, but have characteristics of both. Mixed factory overhead costs must be ultimately separated into fixed and variable components for the purposes of planning and control. Okay. Ang mixed factory overhead cost naman is meron siyang portion na variable overhead. Meron din siyang portion na fixed overhead. So example nito yung telephone bill, yung mga mobile bill, wherein meron dong variable na portion wherein nakarelate either sa dami ng number ng calls and yung laki ng data na pinang internet, and meron din dong tinatawag na fixed portion wherein binabayaran mo lang siya whether gamitin mo yung fixed amount siya, binabayaran mo siya monthly whether gamitin mo man yung phone mo or hindi. So yun yung example ng mixed factory overhead cost. Okay. Factors to be considered in the computation of overhead rate. Okay. Itong overhead rate na binabanggit dito is na-encounter nyo na to during cost accounting cycle. So kung maaalala nyo pa yung cost accounting cycle nyo, meron dong transaction na factory overhead is applied at 80% of direct labor cost, 20% of direct materials. So yung overhead rate, yun yung na-encounter nyo dun sa cost accounting cycle, and it can be in the form of 100% of direct labor cost. Factory overhead applied is 80% of direct labor cost. So yun yung tinutukoy na overhead rate. Ano yung mga factor para makompute yun? Kasi kinocompute din yung tinatawag nating factory overhead rate. Number 1, yung base to be used, physical output, direct materials cost, direct labor cost, direct labor hours, machine hours. Kung mamaya natin i-elaborate yan. Activity level to use. So ang gagamitin ba nating level ng activity ay yung normal capacity, meaning yung normal na operations ng production, or yung normal na nangyayari sa production, or yung ina-anticipate na expected actual capacity. Number 3, inclusion or excluding of fixed factory overhead. So meron tayo ditong absorption costing, method used for cost accounting, and yung letter B, direct costing, which is yung method used for internal reporting or yung management services. Sa absorption costing kasi, ang treatment sa fixed factory overhead ay product cost. Sa direct costing naman, ang treatment ng fixed factory overhead ay period cost. Meaning, sa direct costing, ang fixed factory overhead ay tinitreat as non-production related cost. Kasi nga, period cost yung anyang treatment, non-manufacturing cost. Number 4, use of single rate or several rates. Letter A, plant-wide or blanket rate. One rate for all producing departments. Letter B, departmentalized rate. One rate for each producing department. So mamaya natin i-elaborate tong number 4. pagdating natin dun sa producing and servicing departments. Base to use. Base to use. The base to be used should be related to functions represented by the overhead cost being applied. So, ibig sabihin, hindi lang tayo basta-basta pwedeng gumamit ng base. Kumbaga, pag pipili tayo ng base to use, i-consider din natin yung function ng overhead cost. Hindi tayo basta kung ano lang yung madali, yun na yung gagamitin natin. Dapat, kailangan din natin consider yung function. If factory overhead is labor-oriented, the most appropriate base to use is direct labor hours or cost. Ano ba yung example ng labor-oriented factory overhead? Popular example nito ay yung factory supervision. Kasi nga labor-oriented. More labor yung pagsusupervise. And kapag labor-oriented, ang appropriate base natin is direct labor hours or cost. So, ibig sabihin, kung meron tayong factory overhead na factory supervision na 20,000, sa pagkukompute ng overhead rate, kung ito ay factory overhead na 20,000 at factory supervision, which is labor-oriented, kapag magko-compute tayo ng factory overhead rate, ang magiging base natin dyan is yung direct labor hours, yung number ng direct labor hours. If factory overhead is investment-oriented related to the operation of machinery, then the most appropriate base will be machine hours. So, ibig sabihin naman, kung ang factory overhead or kung karamihan sa factory overhead mo ay investment-related relating sa may investment-oriented related sa machinery, ang base natin will be machine hours. Kasi nga, yung mga machinery na nag-ooperate sa production is normally yun yung nagpe-perform ng overhead functions ng production mo. So, dapat ang base mo is syempre yung machine hours. Kung gaano katagal yung nai-spend ng machine sa iyong production activities. If factory overhead is material-oriented, then materials cost might be considered as the most appropriate base. The simplest of all bases is the physical output or units of production. So, ibig sabihin, ang pinakasimpleng base sa pag-compute ng overhead rate, ang magiging denominator natin ay yung units of production. Yun daw yung pinaka-simple na base. Okay, illustration tayo. Required compute the predetermined factory overhead rate based on number 1, material cost. Number 2, units of production. Number 3, machine hours. Number 4, direct labor cost. Number 5, direct labor hours. Okay. The Round Company estimates factory overhead rate at 450,000 pesos for the next fiscal year. It is estimated that 90,000 units will be produced at material cost of 600. Okay. Conversion will require an estimated 100,000 direct labor hours at a cost of 3 pesos per hour with 45,000 machine hours. Okay. Compute the predetermined factory overhead based on material cost. Alin dito yung material cost sa problem? 600,000. Material cost, 600,000. Units of production. Ilang units yung mapoproduce? 90,000. Units. machine hours. Ang machine hours ay 45,000 hours. So, kinukuha natin yung mga basis natin mamaya sa pag-compute ng predetermined factory overhead rate. Direct labor cost. So, direct labor cost nito ay 100,000 direct labor hours times 3 piso per unit. That is 300,000. And number of direct labor hours, yun ay 100,000 hours. Okay, number 1. Compute the predetermined factory overhead rate based on number 1, material cost. So, factory overhead rate is equal to total factory overhead, which is 450,000 divided by, syempre saan siya nakabase? Material cost. 400,000 divided by 450,000 divided by 600,000, that is 75%. Kumpletuhin natin, 75%. Ang factory overhead rate is 75% of materials cost. Ibig sabihin, ang factory overhead applied is 75% of materials materials cost. Number 2, factory overhead rate is equal to 450,000 divided by number of units produced, 90,000 units. 450,000 divided by 90,000 units is equal to 5 pesos. Kompletuhin natin. Factory overhead rate based on number 2 is equal to 5 pesos per units produced. Number 3, machine hours. Factory overhead rate is equal to 450,000 divided by number of hours, 45,000 hours. That is 10 pesos. Kompletuhin natin. Based on number 3, factory overhead rate is equal to 10 pesos per machine hour. Number 4. Factory overhead rate is equal to 450,000 divided by number of direct labor cost, 300,000 pesos. 450,000 divided by 300,000 pesos direct labor cost equals to 150%. So, kompletuhin natin. Factory overhead rate is equal to 150% of direct labor cost. And number 5, factory overhead rate is equal to 450,000 divided by number of direct labor hours, which is 100. 450,000 divided by 100 is equal to 4 pesos and 50 centavos. Okay, kumpletuhin natin ha. factory overhead rate is equal to 4 pesos and 50 centavos per direct labor hour.